Christian, how are you, my friend?
Oh man, dude, I'm doing amazing. Ever since like I said, that a trip gave me a different kind of energy. I came back, I hit the ground running. Um, Everybody saw the energy that Jeff brought, and I was lucky enough to be his roommate, like I said in the group chat. But that's Jeff. He's like that all the time, and I'm like, I'm not letting him go to sleep without soaking up all the wisdom, all the energy, that he has. And that was just a small part of the experience that I wasn't expecting, right? Because being a history nerd, I was expecting being in all the different places and reading about them, and meeting those different people. I knew that would carry a certain weight, but but the people in our cohorts, the people that we were riding with, those are the people that really, really changed my perspective and my view
Yeah,
on the work that we do.
yeah, man. It was really me. That the whole experience. We've talked about it. You know it. You know how you felt it. We all felt it. It was incredible, and that's like we're carrying that with us, right? I mean, that's what we're here for. So, what are you going to talk about here in this session?
Well, so for me, it was I had an interesting perspective on it being Canadian, right? I'm trying to now fit two lenses in my experience and really trying to find out, okay, where do I fit in this group, in this cohort, and in this story? And I realized quickly, number one, the group embraced me. Everybody brought me in, from Miss Faye to Jeff, to Jordan, right, and yourself. And so quickly, I already adapted and felt a part of the group, which made it easy, right, to see where I fit in the narrative, and then meeting the foot soldiers and them passing the torch to us. It made it way more evident to me that I need to be telling the Canadian story and the realities of what's happening,
Mm,
because the erasure of history can go so quickly. And like Ms. Bland said, the narrative can change. And so from a global perspective, an international perspective, Canada seems to be neutral in all of this, the Underground Railroad, but in reality, it has a deep-seated rooted um, racial history, genocidal history, that it's done such a good job of, hiding. And the uncovering of the bodies last year, is showing the realities of that. So I think I'm just going to start talking about Black Canadian history and the role that we've played that's been so instrumental, and the role that we play today, and how this Ron DeSantis decision is major in what we're experiencing, because we're living in that, in erased history. We're living in a part of
wow.
Canada where they don't tell our story anymore, and we don't even know that we're walking in places where history has literally happened. And so the erasure of history is it's you can see what can happen and where the stories can go. And like Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so we're currently living that. And so part of my story today is sharing what's gone on and the realities of Canada, and which this trip, being on this trip, has really helped me put a language to all that's gone on, from facially neutral. We live in a facially neutral country. When you uncover and unravel what's really gone on, you find out that essentially we've gone out of our way to hide what's happened in Canadian history. And so my journey of that started right there in Atlanta, Georgia, with Hank, talking about what your role is in all of this is to tell the truth and to speak truth to power, despite the uphill battle that it might seem like. And part of it too is forced assimilation and segregation that still exists today. And for me, it was a moment when we were standing on the state capitol in Montgomery, and where George Wallace had said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And for some reason, I heard that quote completely different than I've ever heard it before. And I think he meant that not just physical separation, but the
Yeah.
spiritual, mental, and historical separation, right? The spiritual separation in terms of different religions, right? The mental separation in terms of, inferiority complex, like civilizing the uncivilized. And as the story that Canada's told is we're here to educate the uncivilized and to make society out of everybody. And then, of course, the historical segregation, the realities of what's actually happened. Um, and so again, just putting language to the things that I was seeing and experiencing in Canada, um, through the American system, right? And so again, just looking at the borders of the United States, there virtually is no border. We're meant to think that we're so separated and isolated, and the issues in the United States won't come over here. But in reality, these are ideologies that go beyond borders, and their system that permeates institutes. And ripples through society. And so part of it is we're living in a globalized world where decisions that are made in one part of the country,
Yeah.
specifically the southern United States, are happening over here. And so going again to Selma and seeing Confederate flags, Confederate cemeteries, statues, and then coming back home and seeing trucks with Confederacy flags, right? And people not understanding the repercussions of
Can I
what's
ask you a question
actually
about that,
happening. Yeah.
Christian? So, do you see Confederate flags where you live?
Yes. Yes. Actually, getting to part of it is the response, right? There's always a response to policies that are made. And so in 1911, there was an immigration policy enacted in Canada to limit or to prohibit Negroes from coming into Canada because of the surplus of
Hmm.
Black people that were coming from the southern states. And the response to that was the largest registration of the Ku Klux Klan right here in the prairies. And so you see a lot of the repercussion and ripple effects, right? The Trump mentality that has permeated all of the southern states, leaking into our society and our children and our environment, right? But then the history of our role in all of that has been has been so covered that you don't see it, right? It's hidden wide, right in the open. That's why I loved what Jordan was talking about was books. Um, the like the access to books and the opportunity to read books. And so effectively in the 1800s, there was no books written from other perspective other than the British perspective in Canada. And of course, Canada at the time was a British colony. And so
Yeah.
you look at it and they tell you that slavery didn't exist, it wasn't a thing here. But the beauty of books is they can tell on themselves, right? And so you read some of those historical documents. 1919, Slavery in Upper Canada by William Renwick was a novel that basically explains the entire Canadian slavery situation where enslaved people thought that they were coming into a land that they would be free, but in reality,
Hmm.
right, they illegalized importing of slaves, but having a slave was a whole different thing, right? And so you see that in stories like Marie Joseph Angelique, 1734. A city of Montreal burns on fire, and a black woman is blamed for it. She's essentially tortured and forced to admit that she was the cause of the fire. And when she did admit, she was lynched and burned in front of everybody in
Do you have
1734 Canada.
Do you have some slides you want to share? Because I want to make sure we get to that, or do you just want to
Uh,
talk through this like this?
I do have some slides I'll share, but I think I'll probably end up just talking through this anyways. Just with the amount of information that I honestly have. Is that okay?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
it. Okay.
we got about 10 minutes here.
Okay, that's perfect. Um, but essentially 1734, Marie Joseph Angelique gets lynched in the middle of Canada. And so the trial of Solomon Mosby, another one is laws that were placed where a black is a slave wherever he may be, or a society with slaves rather than a slave society is what they call themselves. And so changing the narrative, like Ms. Bland had mentioned, on uh, on its global perspective, right? So again, uncovering the truth. And so my story is telling the history of Black people and how they were instrumental in creating our country and establishing our country. And so again, changing the narrative from there. All these are people that throughout history that have changed Canadian landscape and politics and uh, movement, right? Economics. And these are people that are never mentioned. And so just even beginning 18 or 1567, right? Matthew da Costa, a free black man who landed and um, helped with the languages. He knew five languages. He was
Mm.
well versed. Lincoln Alexander, right? In Parliament, first in Parliament. Rosemary Brown, William Sylvester, right? Billy Beale. Alberta is very much known as an uh, agricultural province, right, with cattle. And John Ware was amongst the first cowboys ranchers to bring cattle into Canada. And so they never talk about him. Mifflin Gibbs, who also traveled with Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass, of course, talked about what to a slave is the 4th of July, and really putting words to the feelings that we felt over here, right? Being essentially erased from the history books. And so now going on this trip, my perception has completely changed on what my role is being here. And that's completely to be a foot soldier in this community for the people who have funded, who have established themselves, and their stories are virtually untold and covered.
How many black educators are in the world around you? Are you one of a many, or are you one of few?
One of few, and so just to give you numbers, 3% of educators in Canada in higher institutions, so it's even less at
Wow.
the elementary and high school level.
Okay. And when you're teaching, and do you teach this content that you're sharing right here? Do you teach it specifically?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. And
I
um,
make sure that I go out of my way to tell these stories, especially in my classroom, because, I've navigated my way around the curriculum to understand that there's language in there that'll allow me to teach all of this content.
actually, can you unpack that sentence right there? There's language in there. You mean, do you have like parameters for that you're told what to teach, and you're saying that there's leeway in there to teach like some of this diversity?
So again, looking for the language that you guys had taught me is again the facially neutral policies is that one in the social studies curriculum is to teach about immigration in Canada, but historically,
Mm,
what's been taught was from a British, North
yeah, yeah, yeah,
American,
yeah, yeah.
you right perspective. So, from there, there's other people that immigrated to Canada as well, right? So I just teach about those people.
Hmm. That's really powerful. I can totally see how so you're saying the language of the curriculum requires certain things, but those things have almost always normatively been applied through a Eurocentric perspective. But you're bringing a much larger global, and even some, whenever possible, African or American or African American or Afrocentric perspective.
Exactly. And I think that's the issue with the systemic racism that happens here in Canada is that they continually hire um, white teachers
Hmm.
that have been learned in the system and then therefore teach the system, right? Rather than hiring teachers who are well versed in other history. I was born in South Africa. My family's Congolese, so I tie that into the history that I teach in my classroom as well, and talking about the South African apartheid linking in to the residential boarding schools here in Regina, Saskatchewan, which, by the way, the last one closed in 1996.
Yeah, so is the burying of African or African Canadian and uh indigenous, are those histories mutually buried, or is one less buried than another?
I think because of the history of Indigenous people being here since the beginning, that naturally you have to admit the faults that you've made quicker than others, right? So I think 2011 was the first time that the Canadian government formally apologized for the things that they have done to Indigenous people. But then number two construction battalion, which were a group of Black men who fought in World War I by choice. And that was known as the white man's war, and they didn't allow them to fight. They made their own army and joined in
Mm,
whatever way they could,
mm.
anyways. right? So again, the story of rejection, resiliency, and overcoming through these men. And the Canadian government just recently apologized for their actions against Number 2 Construction Battalion.
Wow, that's a picture. We're looking at a picture of them right now. Wow.
And there are many stories of these men who not just these men, but people who have established, Canada in major ways. NHL hockey is a big thing now. And 1893, the Colored Hockey League, over 400 people, 400 black men started this league and made a championships and slap shots and all of these. But when you look through the history books, the first slap shot recorded was in 1963 in the NHL. Right. So, and you see the evident, like the clear burial of the history right in your face when you start to unravel different parts of history.
So let's see, what other slides you got here? I just want to make sure we do justice to the content you got
Okay.
here.
Mifflin Gibbs, I think he's major in establishing the colony of or establishing British Columbia as part of Canada. And so if you look at the creation of Canada, they went and skipped the prairies. In 1905, they then came back to the prairies. And Mifflin Gibbs, who traveled with Frederick Douglass and knew about the American history and moved up to Canada to ensure that American ideologies wouldn't permeate into Canada. So he wanted to confederate. But when you look at the forefathers of British Columbia, he's nowhere in there. Um, and so he's major as well. And I think also looking at the 1905 Last Best West is major in that there was over 1,000 Oklahoma farmers who had immigrated into Canada and were virtually blocked and separated and forced to either assimilate into society or turn back around, and they weren't allowed to come into communities, right? And so now I start to understand what my role in this society becomes when I see that what the active erasure of a history can do.
So let's finish you. Let's close you up with you telling us, and you have been telling us. So this is like, I'm asking this question actually so that I and others
Mhm.
can process it a little bit deeper. What what do you see as your role, Christian? How would you define your purpose as we sit here on May 18th, 2023?
I think that's something I have to reflect on every day since that trip is truly what my purpose is here. And just purely looking at the history here and what's gone on, my purpose is to continue to tell the stories of the people who have established and continue to establish this country and make it what it is. And further than that is to create a historically Black community where others can then see that there is history here akin to that of the United States. There have been movements and revolutions that have gone on here as well, akin to the Civil Rights March, and to ensure that those stories are also told. I think of the Legacy Museum, how that um, highlighted so many people and stories that never got highlighted in for many different reasons. Um, and so I think of establishing that sort of Black community here. And just further than that is to create a global Black community to like understanding that these issues aren't just confined to the United States, but they go across borders and they permeate in institutions.